Hey everyone, welcome to the Undiplomatic Podcast. I'm Matt Dess. Once again, our founder and originator and owner Van Jackson is taking a week off, as is our other co-host Julia Gledhill. But I'm really happy and really I think very privileged to have three great people who I admire on to discuss the Gaza war and the decision that they each made to resign from the Biden administration in protest of the U.S. policy toward Gaza. I'm not going to say too much here. I think if you're watching this or listening to this podcast, you're probably familiar with these folks already, but I'll just introduce them very quickly and then go to them one by one so they can describe their experiences. And then we can discuss this a bit. First, we have Tariq Habash. We have Lily Greenberg Cole and Harrison Mann. I want to let you guys, if you don't mind, just kind of describe, where you came from, how you came to work in the administration, and then we can go from there. Tariq, can we please start with you?
Yeah, happy to. And Matt, thanks so much for having us. Fan of the podcast and fan of your work. So, like you said, I came from the administration. I actually kind of found my path to the administration during the campaign where while working at a nonprofit I founded focused on consumer protection issues and student debt and racial equity in our education system. I volunteered a lot of my time to help shape some of the campaign's policy platforms, supporting some of the organization and drafting of a lot of those memos to create a better and more equitable education system focused on better affordability. And I joined the administration very early on, leading a lot of the long-term policy planning for the Department of Education, a lot of the budget work, and a lot of the regulatory policies to fix the broken student loan system that has really burdened tens of millions of Americans and their families. And unfortunately, it was a job I cared very deeply about, a job that I worked very hard to make an impact in people's lives. And it was crushing to feel like because of the administration's policies and because of the president's continuous dehumanization of Palestinians, including myself, there wasn't really a path for me to be able to communicate with the White House, with National Security Council, with even leaders within my own agency, to feel like I was being heard. And it was clear that the only way I could really use my voice was by resigning and grabbing whatever microphone I could in that moment to tell people my personal story, my experience, and try and make change that way.
So there were, I've heard from a number of folks, there were efforts to do listening sessions, but clearly that didn't get through, or at least you didn't feel that they were listening enough. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I participated in a lot of those listening sessions. My agency did those listening sessions. In addition to that, the White House organized a handful of those. They organized policy briefings, but they more or less felt like checkbox exercises where it was really just about, we have to do this, but we're not actually going to internalize that.
And so what was the moment when you kind of realized that you were going to have to make this decision?
Yeah,
remember?
For me, it was there was like a near daily experience of feeling my identity being erased, feeling the dehumanization, whether it was, discounting the number of deaths reported of Palestinians in Gaza, whether it was claiming that there was a military base inside of a hospital and using that as justification for invading that hospital, which led to the deaths of civilians and infants. All of those different moments kind of played a contributing role. For me, it was just figuring out very quickly that there wasn't really room for me as a Palestinian American to be able to work on policies or contribute to a better policy that centered humanity and centered diplomacy in that moment.
Yeah. Lily, can I go to you next? Can you talk a little bit about, how you came to be in the administration and your process?
Yeah, of course. So I kind of got my start working in politics, well, I guess I was volunteering on local campaigns in San Diego growing up when I was like in middle school, but was a fellow on the Hillary campaign when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, and then did some work in college. I mean, interning with the DCCC and eventually with then Senator Harris's Senate office in DC. And I graduated in 2019 and immediately moved to Iowa to go work for her presidential campaign. When she left the race, I moved to Arizona to join what was, at the time, the Arizona Democratic Party, and Mark Kelly was the top of the ticket at that point, but would eventually become the Arizona Coordinated Campaign for Biden. And that's, my work on the campaign is how I ended up in the administration. A few years later was reached out to by the White House PPO office about joining the Department of Interior, which is where I would land. I was working as a special assistant to the chief of staff in the office of the secretary at Interior. And I guess in parallel to all of that, I am a Jewish American. I have a lot of community in Israel, and have kind of spent my whole life in Jewish community that spans across the U.S. and Israel. Most of the people that I grew up with were non-American Jews who were from Israel, were from other parts of the Middle East, from Latin America, and I had spent many years throughout high school and college involved in pro-Israel advocacy and lobbying work through AIPAC and other organizations. I was very politically active as a young person, and in the communities I grew up in the Jewish day school I went to, regardless of whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, of which my family and I were Democrats, and that was sometimes a minority in my community. But regardless of your sort of place on the American political spectrum, you were pro-Israel, and you were going to be kind of involved in that work, and especially if you were someone like me who was already politically oriented, it was a really natural place to go. And in a lot of ways, working with AIPAC was some of my first exposure to to the lobbying system, to Capitol Hill, to DC. And so I was involved in that world for many, many years. And then throughout college, and then, later in the first few years after I graduated, I would, I got exposed to, a different narrative. And I spent some time working with Palestinians and Palestinian Americans in the human rights work that I was doing, in the campaign work that I was doing, in work with refugees abroad, spent more time in Israel, Palestine, in, time in the West Bank, and in places that allowed me to actually think critically about what I was seeing, and how out of alignment with my values it felt. And so eventually would start to get involved before I joined the administration with some of the Jewish-led anti-occupation work here in the U.S. Groups that are focusing on shifting American Jewish support for Israeli occupation and apartheid. So by the time I joined the administration, I was already, very much involved in those spaces, and that was my Jewish community for all intents and purposes, and was already critical of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Joined the administration, because I really believe in particularly in Secretary Holland, and in having progressive women of color leading organizations and government agencies. And then when October 7th happened, it was very close to people in my community. I know people who were killed, and it just, it completely sort of took over my life for a period of time, in which I was feeling all of this kind of support and empathy from people that I was working with, which was very, appreciated, but I also knew almost immediately, was very clear-eyed about, that whatever was going to happen in response would be absolutely brutal and would also ultimately probably be greenlit by the United States. And so was feeling like a lot of dissonance, right? And also, anger and frustration, and kind of at this, the empathy that was shown, for my Israeli family and friends, that I felt just so clearly did not extend to Palestinians. And even it felt like my reality that I live in, which is, a reality where the first people that, besides Jewish people, who reached out to me on October 7th were my Palestinian friends, some of whom, live in the West Bank and Gaza, and asked if everyone was okay, if my family was okay. That is very much again, my reality that I live, and people that I worked with in the administration couldn't understand that. They could not seem to get their heads around the fact that I could somehow be who I am, right, in the identity and life that I have, and also care about Palestinians and about their well-being and their future and their safety. And these were people that I felt for the most part aligned with on a lot of other issues, and a lot of other other things. And so I kind of similarly to Tariq, participated in these listening sessions, and really tried to make it very clear how I felt that I had a lot of privilege as a Jewish person and as a white Jewish person, in the administration, where I felt almost unimpeachable on this. I knew some of my coworkers who are not white felt that they couldn't speak up in the same way, for fear of being called an anti-Semite or whatnot. And I was just, one, felt that this was too close to not be completely honest, and also felt that it was my responsibility to be very clear that I did not feel supported by the administration's policies as a Jewish person, as someone with Israeli loved ones, did not feel like how the administration was handling this and was talking about Jewish safety in this way that completely, pits it against Palestinian freedom, was productive, and did not feel. Not only was that not received well, but it was. I was very actively marked as a troublemaker by people in administration leadership, and I eventually came to a point where, I like Tariq realized that I had much more power to shift the narrative from the outside, and decided that was worth the sacrifice.
So what does it mean to be marked as a troublemaker? What form does that take?
I was explicitly called that.
Yeah. That's one way, yes.
Yeah.
I know that there are tougher ways that are not as obvious, which is part of how insidious it is.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, I at one point felt, even if this was a few months before I left, that I came to a point where I made a choice. I saw that I could try and maybe in 5 or 10 years be sort of playing the game enough to be at a higher position to maybe have decision-making power around this issue. But to do that, I saw that I would have had to be dishonest about how I felt, right? And not just how I felt, but what the real ramifications that the administration's policy choices are having for people that I care about, and for the safety and future of not just Israelis and Palestinians, but people here in the United States as well, and my entire community. And I just wasn't willing to make that choice. And I think I did feel like a shift in terms of the support that I felt from leadership and from other people around me. Even towards in the kind of what I was saying, that empathy and the like, I'm so sorry for how this is affecting you, and for your losses and all of that. I mean, when when I would come into work like completely frazzled because I spent the whole night trying to get in touch with someone in Rafah and see if they had survived a bombing, and was not able to like mask that in any way, and then was honest about that. That's what I was dealing with. Sometimes I didn't even really receive like human interaction of, oh, I'm sorry, that's terrible. It was more like, I hope you're in therapy, or like, just it was it was incredibly dehumanizing, kind of like on behalf of other people. And I just, that felt so out of line with the supposed mission of, this administration, constantly talking about how diverse and how young and how, progressive for all intents and purposes it is.
Yeah. Harrison, you've had I think a bit of a different background. So why don't you describe for us how you got in and what made your decision?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'm the only one.
Thank you for joining us in transit, by the way. We really appreciate you making the time.
It's my pleasure. Hopefully y'all can hear me well.
Yeah.
Unlike Lily and Tariq, I was not hired by the president. I guess got inherited by him. I have some overlap with them though. I in college I was one of the many NatSec curious people who studied Arabic. That took me to some place in the Middle East, but also eventually, for totally non-political reasons, took me to the West Bank, because I'd already did one summer partying in Beirut, and I was like, okay, where else can I go? But so I went there, and I stayed with the family near Bethlehem. But like many have said, and once you've seen that stuff, you can't unsee it, and it's difficult to come to any opinion but the truth about what is happening in Palestinian territories. So I always had that idea with me, but at the same time, as I entered in the army and largely served in Middle East focused assignments or Arab world focused assignments, it was not an issue that was particularly dear to me. If you work for the U.S. government in the Middle East, you are accustomed to there's a lot of suffering in a lot of places. There's a lot of U.S. policy that inflicts suffering. We have a lot of partners who do a lot of bad things. And, in that broad sense, there's nothing unique about Israel. I mean, in 2017, 2018, I took my team to Bahrain, working for the Naval Forces Central Command there. And a lot of what we were doing was in support of the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Which is not justifying those things, but it's to say, this issue that led us all to resign was not particularly important to me. But on October 7th, at that point, I was working at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I was basically the assistant to the official who was in charge of all analysis for the Middle East and Africa. And he also ended up being the guy who was running the Israel. It was originally the Israel crisis response, and then turned into the pan-regional, pan-Middle East crisis response after October 7th. And I think that was the first time that I had, I was not in an influential position, but I had a very high vantage point to see both what the agency was doing in response and what the DOD and the U.S. government in general were doing in response, and how they were deliberating. And so, even just in the month of October, I was exposed to all of the same really horrific imagery that you all were about what was happening in Gaza and the level of killing and the innocent deaths. But I was also had the view from the inside, and that was what was made it harder for me to brush this off, because I could see that we were tracking all of the events, including the humanitarian disaster, very closely. And in the same breath, in the same conversation or briefing, after talking about how many buildings have been destroyed in this neighborhood that week, we'd go to what we were doing to make sure we were giving our Israeli counterparts all of the support that we needed. And where I directly worked was a direct part of that.
Hmm.
And so as October went on, and I got one indication after another that we were not, and when I say we, I mean both the agency and my office and DoD at large, we were not even going to really talk about the fact that the support that we were giving was also resulting in this humanitarian catastrophe, which we were also tracking at the same time.
Yeah.
Nobody was denying it.
Which was being intentionally inflicted.
Yeah. Well, and that's the, while it was, I think, obviously to everybody on this call being intentionally inflicted, that was an assessment that at least early on, nobody asked for.
Right.
So, and
right.
that was part of what was also jarring, right?
Right.
Normally, especially the people I work with, their job is to draw conclusions about things and
Mm-hmm.
specifically identify why world leaders do the things they do.
Yeah.
But in this case, we'd write, in one line, this neighborhood was blown up or whatever, and then the next line, Israeli far right minister whoever said that he wants to kill and starve all Palestinians, but nobody would do what they would normally do and draw the link and say we think they are doing this because of this, and so
because they have said they want to do this, right? Yeah.
Yes, we would not. Nobody would go that far,
right?
Because at the highest level, and like in my office, nobody felt comfortable leveling criticism of Israel or of the policy. And that also, Lily kind of talked about people being dismissive of her concerns. I didn't feel like I had anybody to tell my concerns to. I didn't think it would be appropriate to bring them up. And I was afraid, of also becoming an outcast if I brought these criticisms up, because nobody else was talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what drove me to submit my resignation, which was just in November. And then I had to keep working for several months, and I made the choice to publicize it, or even to share with my colleagues, because I kind of had reached, I think, I felt very hopeless, and I felt like the rest of the folks, I had to use what little tools at my disposal, so that I would not feel more ashamed of this point in my life.
Yeah. What you say about not actually asking for that analysis. Because and I heard this and know of this in other instances and other issues in other areas, but also on this particular conflict of, you don't ask for that report, because if you get the report back, then you may have to act on it. There will be evidence that what's going on. But the fact that everyone knows what's going on, and we know they know what's going on, but they want this level of deniability. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and in fact, that sort of exact argument was reflected in the NSM 20 report that I think you all recall, that was meant to assess whether Israel was violating international humanitarian law. And they said something in there that was shocking to me, which was basically the Israel section includes a whole disclaimer about how it's just really tough to get to the ground truth about some of these issues and to figure out what's going on and to assess the veracity of claims. It's only difficult if you don't look very hard, right? That's it being difficult to find out is the result of a specific decision to not try harder, to not put more collection assets against the question. So, not knowing is deliberate as well.
Right. I think that's right. A point I've raised repeatedly is that, the United States, the Secretary of State himself stated unequivocally that Russia is committing war crimes within a month. Within a month of the February 2022 invasion. And when you consider the absolutely, the far, far greater level of visibility we have in Israeli military operations, in Israeli policy and doctrine than we do on Russia's, the idea that we would not be able to make such an assessment, even now, it's just ridiculous on its face.
And if I agree, and I would apply that to all of the other factors in this war that the administration has claimed to be surprised by. Whether it's, not having a plan, or I think just this week was finally Biden said, "Oh my God, Netanyahu's been lying to me." So I don't think that shocked any of you all, but all of the things that we claim to not know, it's if we really don't know, that's a choice.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not shocked that he said that. I'm shocked that they think it's good to keep leaking these things. Because people have been loudly and publicly, including Israelis, have been pointing this out for many months. So just one last question before we maybe go back to Tariq is, I'm guessing the listening sessions were very different inside DIA, if they happened at all.
Good sir, this is not State Department. This is not the cookout for the appointees. We don't do those. That's never been part of the culture. But I will. So that didn't exist. My colleagues told me after I left, because I sent my resignation letter around the office, they actually did start them, and because there were a ton of people who felt the same way as me, as I discovered, who literally felt they were doing something wrong and felt like they couldn't talk about it. So they, to their credit, they actually did start those, which from an institutional culture perspective is a big step. It of course won't amount to anything, but I think what they said might not be so different from what Tariq and Lily would have heard from their peers and the one that the administration put out.
Tariq?
Yeah, and the other thing I want to say is, I think it's also important to note that if you're going to purport that you don't have complete visibility into whether there are human rights violations that are occurring, you should want to figure out whether they are in fact happening or not and seek more information if you are also going to be simultaneously pushing for more weapons to be sent to the country where those accusations are being made. And the fact that those weapons not only continued to flow, but there was a huge push by the administration to pass a supplemental of billions of additional dollars in weapons funding is absolutely crazy.
No, they are legally obligated to know. They are required by law to know. And yet we can see that when an administration and a president is committed to circumventing those laws, they can do that. This is not the first time we've seen that happen, of course, but it's just rarely is it, in my memory, has it been so blatant. I think we're now in almost 10 months of this catastrophe. We've seen very little change in U.S. policy. I think we have a new candidate for president now, Vice President Harris. I think it's true that she has spoken about this in a bit of a different way. She has been a bit more critical of Israeli policy and focused a bit more on the Palestinian crisis and lifted up Palestinian lives, I think, in a way that President Biden and others in his team have not. And while I don't diminish that, I think that's important. It is still at the level of rhetoric. And I think what we all want to see is a change in policy. But, thinking about the team now, earlier this week, they announced the selection of Tim Walz as vice president. What are some things that you would like to hear? Granted, she's still vice president. She is not the president. And not wanting to lock ourselves into the realm of let's say the possible, but let's think about in terms of the possible. What should we hope to hear from candidate Harris that would signal some of the right things to you? Tariq, why don't you start?
Yeah, first and foremost, calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, and not just saying that you want to see a ceasefire, but that you are using your leverage as the current vice president of the United States of America to make that happen. I think that would go a long way to assuring people that this isn't just rhetoric. You're actually going to put action and policy in place that might be different from what the president is doing. And obviously, I think there is an obligation for her as vice president to stay in line with the president's policies, but you are also the presumptive nominee and the future of your party. And so you have an obligation to yourself and for the American people to communicate to them how you are going to be different when you become president, and to show them that there is a reason for them to unite behind you. And I think that first and foremost is the most critical component of this. I think another really important part is showing people how you will ensure that this horrific violence not only ends, but will prevent a regional escalation. I think we have seen time and time again over the last few months, Israel try and goad Hezbollah and Iran into a regional escalation. And it's only a matter of time before that happens if we don't actually put our foot down and stop that escalation from happening. And I think that's really important, because not only is that dangerous for the entire region, but it's dangerous for American lives as well. And for the president of the United States not to be thinking about American interests and American lives, that's extremely dangerous. So I think those two things need to be prioritized. And then I would say third, just enforcing the law. Like, we supposedly care about the international rules-based order. We supposedly care about US law. When I was working on student loan stuff, we spent months and months litigating the actual parameters of what we could and could not do based on the law. It seems like on this particular issue, we are completely ignoring what the law says and what we are required to do. Let's just basically follow the law. It seems like a crazy thing to say out loud, but I think that matters too.
Lily, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with everything that that was said. I think it is very clear that that people want more than rhetoric, and they want more. There's both a need for acknowledgement, and I think one of the reasons why there's been so much energy around Kamala in these last, like, I guess 2-3 weeks, is that I think voters were feeling kind of gaslit by the Democratic Party, because they were seeing very clearly that, you know, President Biden is not necessarily fit to for another 4 more years, and then we're being told, you know, that he is up to the job, and people. And I think it's the same thing has been happening for the last 10 months, 11 months in Gaza, right? People are seeing every single day footage on their social media of some of the most horrific things that they've ever seen. And then they know that their tax dollars, you know, and that American-made weapons are causing those atrocities. And they're seeing the U.S. government justify that, right? And refuse to, you know, they're seeing the administration refuse to engage in good faith with members of the press, with voters, with even people within the administration. And so I think there has been this feeling of gaslighting, of, you know, we're seeing something happen and we're believing it, and then we are being told to basically ignore that, or that that's not true and it's not happening by our leadership. And
Or
so
that we're not seeing it. We don't see it.
Or yeah. Right. So then there creates this sense of, I mean, I guess a mistrust in,
Right.
yeah. I mean, for many months, you know, anything with the words like genocide wasn't making it to the president's desk, right? Which feels insane that someone, you know, a voter in America could feel that they are more informed than the president of the United States. Does not inspire a lot of confidence in leadership.
Right.
So I think a lot of the energy around her has been this, you know, the fact that this is a recognition, right? That something needed to change. And I think if she wants to continue that momentum, there has to be, like, also recognition of the suffering of Palestinians and the U.S.'s role in it, and some real. A real signal that the status quo is going to change. And I mean, as Tariq said, not just for you know, the lives of everyone in the lives of his Palestinians and Israelis and people in the region, but, you know, the last thing that I think American voters want is for there to be a massive war, you know, that we are implicated in or a part of.
Harrison.
Yeah, I think they covered it all. I would just say, you know, her and I'm really, most of my thoughts are focused on the existing president, to be honest, because I think I would just like to emphasize that waiting for Kamala Harris to become president, even if she turned out to just say, hey, Tariq, Lily Harrison, come here, I'm going to do whatever you say on Palestine, that's 5-6 months from now. And in that time, you know, I don't know how, you know, there could be 1 million people starved and dying of disease by then in Gaza. And equally urgent, as Tariq and Lily both mentioned, is a war, a larger war, probably begins between Israel and Hezbollah. And I would only venture that, say you were an Israeli prime minister who's really intent on starting a new war, right before the American election that you want Donald Trump to win might be a better time than after a slightly less friendly to president in the form of Kamala Harris takes office. So I'm kind of still focused on what we need the current administration to do. Because if we wait for January, this problem might take care of itself in the worst way possible.
Right. Well, listen, I would love to keep this going for a really long time, and I hope we have, and I expect we'll have another opportunity to pick this up, all of us. But let me just say this. I mean, this city is a machine to get you to violate your own principles. It's a machine that's designed to offer us all the easy choice instead of the hard choice. And each of you made the righteous choice. And that's why I'm just so privileged to be here with you. I'm privileged to know you. And you are an inspiration, and you give me hope. So I'm really excited to see what you're going to keep doing, to see what you build from now on, and really excited to keep working with you. And just want to thank you for taking some time to talk with us today.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Grateful that there's people like you in this place.
Thank you. All right. Great to be with you all. And friends, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Diplomat.